All right, guys, we are back with chapter 24, which I only have 9 slides, so this should be pretty quick. This spans again from about the end of the Civil War up until 1900, and it covers mainly stuff kind of related to the Industrial Revolution. So at the end of the 1800s, for the majority of our country's history, agriculture had been the biggest industry. Again, Thomas Jefferson's idea for the country was that we were going to be a bunch of independent small farms. But by 1900, it had decreased significantly because a lot of people realized that there was more profit to be found in big business and industry rather than farming. So they started to turn their attention to that, even ignoring political positions that maybe would have helped out the politics aspect of the Gilded Age. But another reason they were able to expand as much as they did was because of railroads. Without the railroads, we would not have been able to get goods places quickly and cheaply. And it's really because of these reasons that America starts to set out on its own path of being a world power and leader, both politically and economically. Railroads, like I said on the last slide, were a really big part of this. And the main piece that we're going to focus on with the railroads is just that they're just laying track everywhere. Just keep that in mind. So the Union Pacific Railroad was commissioned first in the middle of the Civil War to start laying track heading west. And then eventually the Central Pacific Railroad joined them and started laying track from the West Coast eastward. And they ended up meeting in Utah. They were paid for their work by Congress, and they were kind of paid depending on what sort of land they were building on. But largely immigrants were taking these jobs, immigrant men. For the Union Pacific Railroad Company, it was the Irish immigrants, and for the Central Pacific Railroad, it was the Chinese immigrants. So without these people, we would not have had this, and without this connected railroad, we would not have succeeded as quickly as we did during this time. We also see the emergence of monopolies and trusts. Tycoons, big business leaders at the time, were not interested in having other companies competing with them. So they would use tactics like vertical integration to try to make sure they could make a ton of money without sharing it with other people. So they wanted to keep everything within their company. So if you were producing something like, let's say, railroad ties, you would want to be responsible for getting the materials for the steel and the iron, and you'd want to be involved in the production of that and the molds of that and the shipping of that and keeping everything in your company so you can maximize profits for yourself and keep other businesses out of the market, essentially, because they wouldn't be able to keep up with your prices. But in some cases that wasn't possible, and so when they did have to share, they would try to make deals with competitors to keep their prices in a range that would be beneficial to both. So essentially, again, because competition usually drives down prices of things, but they would work with each other to keep their prices up consistently so that they would both benefit. But we also see the emergence of trusts, which it's kind of a complicated thing to explain in this context. So I'm just going to explain it as essentially people could buy stocks in a company if you had enough of that, enough of a piece of that company, you were able to start making decisions for that. And essentially the point of trust was to keep as much control over the market as you could at the time. So a great example of that would be the Standard Oil Company, which again you can reference in your book if you need to. We see steel and oil booming during this time and the emergence of people like Carnegie and Rockefeller. So steel was found to be stronger than a lot of other metals, and that made it very valuable, especially when looking at things like railroad ties, because you want your railroads to be sturdy. And the production of the steel that they were using became cheaper, which meant that they could produce it more efficiently, and it would be a more viable option for Americans interested in building things that would need that. So Carnegie was kind of the head guy in steel at the time. He was not your typical millionaire, though, which is kind of rare at the time and today. He wasn't interested in dying with this huge company. So he ended up selling it to JP Morgan for about $400 million. And he spent $350 million of that on philanthropy projects like building libraries and all those sorts of things. There are libraries even across our state that were built, by Carnegie and wouldn't have existed without him in little small towns. So that was kind of an excellent thing that he did. He thought it was a disgrace to die with a bunch of wealth. But oil also became an important industry at the time. It was discovered in America around 1859 in large quantities anyway. And it was first supported because of kerosene being used in lamps. And as electricity started to fade out the use of kerosene, automobiles started becoming a big thing, which also required oil. So the market just kind of continued to increase. Rockefeller was the big name of the oil industry, but he was not the same kind of touchy-feely guy as Carnegie. He was a pretty ruthless business owner and would do anything in his means to get rid of competition or defeat his competition when possible. And that leads us to social Darwinists, which is a theory of the time that essentially said the people at the very top deserve it because they have greater abilities naturally. The survival of the fittest idea. And capitalism definitely runs by this theory of those that are equipped to do well are going to do well, and the rest are going to fall by the wayside. So you just have to kind of learn to do well. But again, Carnegie agreed, I would say, to some extent with this, but he also believed that wealth should not just be kept to those that earned it. He thought that it would be disgraceful to die, like I said, being a wealthy person. So here's a quote from the beginning of his essay, The Gospel of Wealth. The problem of our age is the proper administration of wealth, so that the ties of brotherhood may still bind us together, the rich and the poor, in harmonious relationship. The conditions of human life have not only been changed but revolutionized within the past few hundred years. In former days, there was little difference between the dwelling, dress, food, and environment of the chief and those of his retainers. So Carnegie is very aware of the growing gap between the rich and the poor, which is kind of the classic change of the Industrial Revolution, one of the major changes of the time. So what were the overall impacts of the Industrial Revolution? Well, people on average did see their standard of living rise, which is a good thing. That doesn't mean everyone is benefiting from this, but on average. We also see the growth of cities because people would move into city or urban areas for jobs. And women, again, as with the first Industrial Revolution, are starting to have more opportunities for jobs. But we also see this kind of discord between the classes because the rich people just keep getting richer and the gap is widening and widening between the two, and they start to kind of detest each other. And the farmer thing, again, as I talked about in the beginning, became a wage earner thing. So less people are farming and more people are just working for a wage and not owning their own business or being self-sufficient. Okay, I believe this is the last slide. It sure is. Okay. Finally, during all of this, the working conditions of a lot of people were not great at the time, especially factory workers. They worked long hours. Children and women were treated horrendously. Men were too, of course. But just a very dangerous place to exist. But many people needed these jobs, so they had to do it. And the work environment itself lent itself to big business owners instead of the workers because there were lots of immigrants coming in and they could just replace workers who weren't willing to work for their wages with these new immigrants who were desperate for jobs. So they really had no shortage of labor for the most part. Even strikes for the first part of this time period we're talking about weren't a huge deal for business owners because they would just find replacement workers, and that wasn't a huge concern. But after the Civil War, and during especially, there were a lot of men that had left the factory work to become soldiers. And so there were less people available for the workforce. So they had a little bit more leeway and leverage So strikes would actually make a difference because they couldn't just replace them because they didn't have a lot of people laying around without jobs to pick it up. So we really see the emergence of labor unions at this time to get workers organized and protect them from their employer in cases where they were being abused or taken advantage of. But sometimes these laborers would kind of rise up in a violent sense too. So, again, an example of that would be the Haymarket Square, which was a protest that got violent in Chicago. Someone blew up a bomb because they were upset. So, just kind of an overall picture of the Industrial Revolution Part 2 in America. I hope that helped all of you guys, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.